I call this the Great Con. How could it be that the civil rights movement, which was deeply, deeply nonviolent, deeply, deeply constructive and not destructive, deeply, deeply American, has allowed the Palestinian movement, which is so addicted to terror and so anti-American at its core, how has it allowed it to steal and hijack the symbols of the civil rights movement? And African Americans, both from the far left and from the far right, have always been very, very careful not to let people come in and steal their symbols, right? When Black Lives Matter came out and a university president said, all lives matter, she was almost forced to resign because they said, no, you're not understanding the uniqueness of our cause. And that protectiveness somehow, when it comes to the Palestinian movement, falls apart. And we saw this around George Floyd, that they literally went in and used all the symbols of the chokehold, of the knee, saying that we are one. And as a result, it's actually been very, very destructive to Zionism on campus and to the American Jewish community, because the American Jewish community worships progressives and worships the civil rights movement and is so proud of the American Jewish role in the civil rights movement. And then these people come in and literally distort history and steal the power and the emotional power and the symbolic power of one of the most sacred and effective movements in American history.
You're making me think actually that in doing so, it has warped the civil rights movement. And what we see now in the Black Lives Matter movement is not civil rights, and anti-racism, that sort of paradigm is not civil rights. The whole critical theoretical paradigm it's not about civil rights. Can you say more about what that's like now?
I have a problem. I'm an American historian. So I read Martin Luther King, and I try to understand what was his power. Now, people like to say, the United States is systemically racist and there's so much racism today. And I don't diminish the suffering that many individuals endure. But we cannot compare the racism of today, as awful as it is, with the racism of the 1950s, the 1960s. And so I go back to the 1950s and the 1960s. I understand, how did it work? And Martin Luther King was very, very careful, and the civil rights movement was very, very careful, A, to be nonviolent, but B, to be deeply American. He invokes the Constitution. He invokes the Declaration of Independence. He invokes an Americanism and is basically saying to America, to the South, live up to your ideals. To the North, this is what you fought the Civil War for. And now what we've seen is a nihilism in the African American movement, not all over. And for example, the middle-class blacks in South Carolina who elected Joe Biden in the South Carolina primary showed that the heart of Black America is still very much in sync with Martin Luther King's values. But there's a radical anti-racism which brooks no dissent, which says if you don't agree with our agenda completely, you are not just not an anti-racist, but you are racist. And part and parcel of this indoctrination and this new orthodoxy is that Palestinianism is central to their cause. And I think it's a distortion of the civil rights movement. I think it's a distraction from the important work that still needs to be done in the civil rights movement. And it also hurts America because we've seen again and again in the attacks on the White House, on the Lincoln Memorial, on the Democratic National Committee, on LAX, on JFK airports during Christmas time, that the pro-Palestinian movement today is deeply, deeply anti-American. And why would the civil rights movement want to be a part of that too?
It seems like increasingly the pro-Palestinian movement has moved away from being actually pro-Palestinians and has become really just a front for being anti-Israel or even pro-Hamas. Is that how you see this?
This is the great tragedy of the Palestinian national movement. And before we get to today, let's go back 30, 40, 50 years ago. Again and again, rather than seeking compromise, again and again, rather than seeking a constructive approach, the Palestinian nationalists have used the Palestinian people to push an aggressive agenda, which is against compromise, against peace, against living with Israel. That's why Oslo blew up. That's why Ehud Olmert's very generous series of offers to Mahmoud Abbas in 2007, 2008 blew up, because again and again, the leaders of the Palestinian movement don't want a solution that includes Israel. They don't want a two-state solution. And by the way, I saw a recent poll that shows that 89% of the Arab world rejects Israel's existence. And so we've seen from the very start of the Palestinian national movement's entry into international popularity, which is the 70s. That's what I'm talking about, 50 years. But if we even go back to 1947, there's a great book by Ephraim Karsh. He calls it Palestine Betrayed. Who betrayed the Palestinians? The extremists. Hajj al-Husseini. All those militants then who were allied with Hitler, some of them, and who didn't want to allow a Jewish state to exist. Now we look today and we see it's gotten even worse. Because now we have two problems. One is we have what's going on in the Palestinian national movement, which is all about Hamas and its destructive sadism and its anti-Semitism and its anti-Zionism, which we saw in full display in its ugliness on October 7th. And it's intertwined with a progressivism, which I call regressive progressivism. I call it an illiberal form of liberalism, which takes very important ideas about equality, about dignity, about fighting racism, and goes all accelerator, no brakes, and takes them to an extreme position, clumps them all together, thank you intersectionality, says there's only one way of thinking about this, and if you deviate in any way, you are evil. And if you try to bring in any facts that are counter, you're also evil. And the test case of that is on October 7th, hundreds of thousands of Jewish students woke up on campus, read the reports, and said, oh my goodness, I wasn't thinking that much about being Jewish October 6th. But I realized I'm seeing what's happening, and this was a deep, deep attack on me, on us. This was an attack that echoes through centuries of oppression and centuries of hatred and centuries of bigotry. Similar group on the laboratory called the American Campus of feminists woke up that same day, and on October 6th, we would guess that their identity as feminists, their intolerance for any form of gendered violence, their sense of Me Too and silences violence and all that was so much deeper than your typical Jewish student. But instead, because the progressive position was to say that the violence against Israel was exhilarating, the violence against Israel this is what decolonialism looks like, the violence against Israel is justified, they couldn't even respond to the core challenge to their own identity as feminists. And so we see there a really dangerous form of corruption. If I can't deal with the facts, and I can't deal with the truth, and I can't deal with justice, when we see the largest, most self-promoting act of gendered violence in history, and I'm struck silent. So yes, I call this the triple double cross. They threw the Jews under the bus. Unfortunately, we're kind of used to that. They threw liberal ideals under the bus. We've been seeing that happening on the campus for 20, 30, 40 years. That's part of your important story too. But they betrayed themselves. They betrayed their core ideals. And 4-5 months later, we still haven't heard enough of the mainstream feminist movement. We've heard some feminist voices speak up, but we've actually heard more of those feminist voices going to the National Organization of Women, going to other places, going to the 120 departments of gendered studies who condemned Israel in May 2021, saying, where are you? And the silence is deafening. Now, for example, came out with a statement finally on November 30th. It just happened to be missing words like Hamas, October 7th, Israel. It just was against rape during wartime. I guess somebody raised it over Thanksgiving dinner. It was 4 days after Thanksgiving Sunday. But what is that? That is a form of corruption, and it's a form of real evil, which is very dangerous, and it's warping our young students' minds, and unfortunately it's warping the conversation, not just on campus, but in many mainstream liberal circles as well.
You're making me think of two things. One, which is not about anti-Semitism, and one which is. And the one that's not about anti-Semitism is the silence of feminists about like Iran and how women are treated there and in other Muslim countries. There's some kind of, I don't know if it's blindness or if it's just an inability to reconcile the two different sacred values, I guess. And so that's one thing. And then the other is the one that has to do with anti-Semitism is International Holocaust Day, on which important international figures made statements that didn't talk about Jews.
So let's start with that, the first one, because the Iran case is fascinating because it shows two blind spots. One is there is this blind spot where the progressive left, And again, this is not an attack against mainstream liberals. Look at John Fetterman, who says, don't call me a progressive anymore. I agree with you about unions, and I agree with you about minimum wage, and I agree with you, but I will not let an anti-Israel obsession, an anti-Zionist obsession, an anti-Semitic obsession be central to liberalism. That's not liberalism, and that's not progressivism. So my attack is on these illiberal liberals. You want to call them totalitarian identitarians, you want to call them woke, you want to call them critical race theorists, you want to call them anti-racists. They have different names, but fundamentally it's a group of people who are fanatic. And you're bringing out an excellent test of two parts of their fanaticism. One is Islam is holy. You can never criticize anything about Islam or anything about Islamists. And I've been very careful in my career. I've never attacked Islam, but I've repeatedly attacked Islamism. I've attacked jihadism. And I've actually rarely been called on that. I've been very pro-Israel and very pro-America for many, many years. And no one's ever accused me of being Islamophobic, because I'm not. I respect Islam, their religion, but I actually think it's a form of respect of Islam to show that there's this distortion which is hijacking the core ideals. So Islam is perfect and cannot be attacked. Islamism is perfect and cannot be attacked. So you see that blind spot. And so they don't talk about honor killings among Palestinians or in Iran. And then the second piece is there's a blind spot about Iran, which goes back to the Obama administration. A core part of Obama's political identity, not just his foreign policy, was reaching out to Iran, reaching out to the mullahs, showing that we could deal with them. And we heard his silence so powerfully when the Green Revolution happened and he didn't speak up. We heard his silence so powerfully when we were in negotiations over the Iranian nuclear treaty. And I just kept on saying, if John Kerry just throws one temper tantrum, let him knock over the table, run away, A, they'll come back to us, B, we'll get a better deal, and C, he and Obama will be way more popular. But there was this blind spot, and unfortunately, the blind spot continues. How could it be that the United States of America has absorbed over 180 attacks by Iranian proxies? And we've lost at least 3 service members, and dozens of others have endured traumatic brain injury, which isn't being mentioned mostly in the press. And yet, we've attacked the proxies, but we haven't gone to the head of the snake. We have to take on Iran. I don't want us to bomb Tehran. I don't want us to kill many, many people. Of course not. But we have to push back. And Iran, by the way, has shown a very low tolerance for absorbing losses when it's on their territories. They love to play the chessboard and love to use the pawns of the Houthis and Hamas and the Israelis. But when you take it to them, they tend to get much more cautious. And the United States of America has to be a superpower. So we see these two blind spots about Iran and about Islam intersecting in a stunning silence about anti-gay violence in Iran, anti-women violence against Iran, and illiberal violence against dissenters, against critics. And I actually believe that if the world put more pressure on the regime would collapse. But the world hasn't put the pressure it should on Iran. So that's the one piece. And then, of course, you add to it the anti-Semitic blindness. And, I grew up as somebody who didn't experience a lot of anti-Semitism growing up in New York. I don't want to build a modern Jewish identity or even a modern Zionist identity as an anti-Semite or an anti-Zionist. I think it's so important that we celebrate the good and that we come together on positive values. But when you see again and again the disproportionate obsession about Israel, the fact that Israel isn't allowed to defend itself, the fact that, if on October 7th, our pro-Palestinian brothers and sisters on campus and elsewhere had stopped for a second, both Palestinians and progressives, and sat with their Jewish friends and sat with their Israeli friends just for 5 minutes, just for 10 minutes, say, you know what? Wow, this is really ugly. This is really horrible. No human beings should ever be killed en masse. No little children should ever be beheaded. And then on October 10th, 12th, or whenever, started protesting about Israeli tactics in fighting. Then we'd have a debate about what Israel does. But their hatred showed that it was about what Israel is and who Jews are. And that is toxic. And we have to have zero tolerance for that. And when I say we, I say as Americans, not only as Jews.
That actually brings up a question that I hadn't thought to talk to you about, but that it is something that I think about a lot, which is the tension between freedom of speech and these slogans, chants, etc. On the one hand, I think there is a point at which those things cross a boundary and create a hostile climate for Jewish students, but it's not day one. However, if you say that we have no tolerance for anti-Semitism, that is a type of censorship. And so I sort of would prefer for people on campus to say, we have a certain amount of tolerance for anti-Semitism, and we have the same amount of tolerance for racism and, anti-gay speech and, all the bigotries. We have a certain amount of tolerance for them because we're a society that believes in free speech. But nobody does that.
So again, it goes to my thing about we're in a world of all accelerator and no brakes. Everything's extreme. If we go back to the reprehensible performance of the 3 college presidents, there were 2 problems with what they were saying. One was they were pretending that they lived on this free speech utopia. Mm-hmm. They were pretending that there hadn't been 10, 15 years of people being called out for looking at people the wrong way, for silly things called microaggressions, that there wasn't this sense that Harvard and University of Pennsylvania in particular ranked lowest on standards of free speech. Mm-hmm. And I'm with you, I'm a free speech absolutist. One of the first things I said, the first time I spoke about October 7th to a group of Canadians, and Canadians seem to be even less absolutist when it comes to free speech, I said, let them do their thing. Mm-hmm. Let Americans and Canadians see how ugly they are. Mm-hmm. Let them protest, who would never imagine that they would protest in front of the White House, or the Lincoln Memorial, or the Sloan Memorial Kettering Institute, but whatever it is, let them do it. Right? And let us see who's on which side. So I'm with you in that fundamentally I'm a John Stuart Mill liberal. When I say, when they said, oh, well, we have to allow this free speech to take place on campus, everybody went, but you focus on fatophobia just because somebody, made a joke about gaining 20 pounds. And in my lifetime, I've lost and gained 50 pounds. I'm going to, right? But I'm not allowed to make jokes even about myself. So that was the one disconnect. And the second disconnect was the degree to which you really sensed that there was a hierarchy of what speech was intolerant, what wasn't going to be tolerated, and what speech was going to be tolerated. And somehow, it just so happens that when you get to genocide for Jews, that's tolerated. Then all of a sudden you become a free speech absolutist. It was the hypocrisy and the inconsistency. So in an ideal campus, I would use different words, but I would say the same thing, which is that I still want to have zero tolerance for anti-Semitism and racism and sexism and all kinds of bigotry, meaning that we all have to work really hard to fight against those forms of bigotry. At the same time, I do have to have tolerance for speech and distinguish between speech and action. So when on the Harvard campus, a Israeli student who was walking around, who was videoing with his iPhone a protest, and when they laid hands on him, the moment they laid hands on him, they crossed a line.
Yeah.
When they started bullying him physically and menacing him, they were approaching that line. But when they were simply yelling and screaming from afar, we have to learn how to yell and scream. So I agree that we don't want to get all snowflakey and start clamping down on speech. But at the same time, we can say there are certain things that as a community to us are abhorrent, and we want to fight it every which way without clamping down on speech.
Yeah, that's a good way to frame that. Back to this, since you're a historian, I don't want to leave the opportunity unexplored to talk about the ethnic studies movement and its impact on this relationship between the Palestinian cause, as much as it isn't about Palestinians, and I wouldn't say civil rights movement, but maybe the Black Panthers and the other kinds of groups in the U.S.
It's interesting because for the last 10, 15 years, some of us have been involved in a conversation about what's happening on campus. And many of us have our stories of when we had our moment. My moment goes back 22, 23 years ago during what the Palestinians call the Second Intifada. I call it the war against peace in Oslo, when I saw that academics who could make anything complicated, right? They could walk into Starbucks and write 30 papers about the history of coffee and the economics of why I'm willing to pay $6.75 for a $1 cup of coffee, and why you always sit in the corner working away and I always have to come with a group of 5, and they're doing anthropology, sociology, right? They can make anything complicated. When it comes to this very complicated conflict, Zionism is racism, Israel apartheid. Really? And that was my break. So there's been a conversation about what's going on campus. You're raising a really important point, because what's happened is that those students, many of our most idealistic students who aren't just going to sell their soul to the corporate devil, go to teach. They go into elementary schools. They go into high schools. And they come with that agenda, the social justice agenda, the anti-racist agenda. And again, I'm in favor of social justice. I'm against racism. But it's a very particular illiberal agenda. And now what we've seen, and we're finally waking up to it, but this has been an insidious movement for a long time, and the California Ethnic Studies curriculum is just the most dramatic example of all kinds of subtle things that are happening in the Newton public schools, in Brooklyn, in Hillcrest High School. We saw the inevitable result when a mob went after a Jewish teacher who dared to be pro-Israel. We're starting to see in the elementary school and the high school level a real propagandism, right? So woke kindergarten. What the heck, right? Why would you take such a political movement and impose it? But we understand that there is a political notion that says that everything these days is about Palestine, everything these days is about fighting racism, and if you're not systemically fighting the systemic evil, then somehow you're part of the evil. And so what we have to do is acknowledge three things. One is it's a distortion again of the Palestinian cause, because it's just looking at the Palestinians as victims. It's not respecting decisions they and their leadership have made to seek the whole thing and not compromise over the years. So I think it distorts Palestinians and treats them as children, not with agency. And I said this actually out of respect for the Palestinian national movement. If it was a grown-up movement and took responsibility for its decision. It distorts, as we said, the civil rights movement and the story of nonviolence and heroism and Americanism that was intertwined in the civil rights movement. And now it's turning into something that's against Jews. This whole notion that Jews have white privilege tries to rob Jews of the amazing story that we can tell in America of a people oppressed, depressed, miserable, poor, unfree for so many years, for so many decades, for so many millennia, come to America. And with very little, but with their smarts and their sweat, start building. When my grandfather walked down the street, people didn't say, oh, there's a man with white privilege. They said, oh, there's a Polish Jew. He's obviously an immigrant from the way he dresses and his big ears and his heavy Polish accent. But he was able to make it in America. They were generation making it. And we're Generation Hope, because we inherited this amazing hope. And that's being robbed of our kid. It's being robbed from us, and it's being robbed from our kids. Our kids are growing up where they're in America where they're propagandized, and they're told it's systemically broken. A few years ago, I was running, and I fell, and I broke my wrist. And a doctor friend of mine said, well, you know, at our age, when it's mechanical and not systemic, you're doing okay. And it was a great line, but actually I think it's a real important line when it comes to true liberalism, true progressivism. We have to look at every problem in the world, especially in our wonderful country called America, as mechanical. We fix them. If it's systemic, then you start saying, I'm throwing up my hands. One of the things that makes me so confused these days is I don't understand how to navigate a world where progressives don't believe in progress and conservatives don't conserve institutions. So we have to call out the extremists on both sides. And I actually believe that there's a silenced majority out there, I call them the silenced majority, who really just wants to send their kids to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. You should get politics at home. Who just want to get back to the basics at university. Who are scrimping and saving to pay $20,000 or $40,000 or $75,000 a year for their kids to get the best credentials they can get and the best, sharpest critical thought. And to go and see them turn into propaganda factories, first of all, I call it academic malpractice. But secondly, it's a form of corruption, because you're selling one product, credentials, American capitalism, success, and critical thought, but you're imposing a very different agenda, which is against every one of those values and every one of those skills.
So it's like a bait and switch.
Yep. And we used to complain about the corruption in American higher education, where we all came to universities thinking we were getting the best teachers, and we discovered that they're hired based on their research. Right. That's the old form of corruption. Now it's even worse, where we come in, we think we're getting the best teachers and researchers, and they're hired. And look at the way the hiring practices go in the American Sociological Association and the American Historical Association. It's a kind of internal elite. And if you don't sign on the bottom line, and if you don't buy into the whole package, then you're not going to get ahead. You're not going to get promoted. You're not going to get hired. You're not going to get promoted. You're not going to get a book prize. You're not going to get anything. You're not going to get a letter's recommendation. You're going to be shut out. And so people end up mimicking the ideology, even if they don't believe it, because they want to get ahead in that system.
you're sort of pointing to this split between think tanks and universities, where there's a certain cachet to being at a university, but what you call the silenced majority is also at the university, both professors and students, in addition to the parents that are sending them, right? Whereas at think tanks, I don't think people feel silenced. But then the work that comes out of these think tanks gets pointed to as illegitimate because it didn't come out of a university.
It's an interesting thing, particularly in the 80s, Republicans started going to think tanks in Washington because they felt that they didn't have a home in the university. And when we write the history of the university, it's one of the things that accelerated the process because there was a vacuum. Now, they weren't getting hired, so I understand why they went elsewhere. But by completely giving up, it only got worse and worse. I'm an old-fashioned professor. There's nothing as exciting as the magic of the classroom. There's nothing as exciting as sitting down with a group of young learners who want to have what the great philosopher Martin Buber called an I vow, where you can see in their eyes back and forth. You know what that's like? It's like it's so exciting, and you go on a journey. On Thursday night, on Wednesday night, I spoke to a group of students at Tufts Hillel, and they asked really thoughtful, substantive questions. Some of them were critical of my position, but they were with respect and with thought, and they came to learn. And they came to disagree, but they came to disagree agreeably, not disagreeably. And you walk out jazzed, you say, this is what university is all about. Just this morning, I had the privilege of sitting around with a group of 7th and 8th graders who were preparing for Model UN. And they were so earnest and so sincere and had such great questions. And you walk out saying, that's what education is all about. The fact that I've sometimes hosted students, and the first thing I say, just kind of like, the first time I said it, I was just kind of saying, as obvious, I was talking about Israel, and I said, well, of course, there's always room to disagree, and I hope that during the course of our hour and a half together, you'll ask me difficult questions, because if we don't ask the hard questions when we're together, then we can't learn together. Professor Troy, are you serious? One of them says, I've never been invited to ask a difficult question in my life. And I said, no, you're kidding. And we went back and forth, and instead of talking about Israel, like after half an hour, I said, guys, we've got to stop this. We have an agenda. I've been invited to speak to you about something. But these students, and they said something really terrible. They said, we walk into a room, and we know who the most extreme people are. And they're usually talking about the people on the left. And we know that if we don't say what they want us to, or if we disagree, they will Twitter shame us. And they say, it's just not worth it. They say, why bother? And so the small group of campus commissars, of martinets, bully everyone else because the silent majority at the end of the day just wants to go to the movies and learn, but it leads to what Natan Sharansky calls, channeling George Orwell, doublethink, right? And he says he comes from the Soviet Union. And the two biggest shocks to him, getting out of the Soviet Union, were one, he always saw anti-Semitism as the tool of a dictator. And to see anti-Semitism in democracies, to see anti-Semitism flourishing on college campuses was just like, it didn't make sense, right? Because it is a totalitarian ideology.
Yeah.
And the second thing, to see the best and the brightest, young, smart students parroting the line, double thinking. And doublethink means that you think one thing, but you say a different thing in order to get ahead, in order to fit in. To see that happening at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, at Rutgers, at University of Chicago, at state universities, he was in shock. And we go, oh yeah, but we should be in shock. We should say this is completely unacceptable. It goes against the core mission of the university, the core values of the university, and the core mission and values of the United States of America. It really is a fight to regain Americanism. Not Donald Trumpian Americanism, not Bidenism, but simple, good old-fashioned Americanism, which was the great secret to success that made this country the world's first mass middle-class civilization, that kept on growing more and more freedoms, more and more opportunities, more and more tolerance. Have we reached capacity? Absolutely not. Is there always more to do? Absolutely. But the formulas that worked, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, trying to achieve those ideals has now, the formulas themselves have been denigrated. And as a result, how do we go ahead? How do we build? How do we grow? And how do we have a common language? So I can disagree with you about what to do in Gaza. I can disagree with you about how big the budget can be, but I also remember that we have core values as Americans that unite us.
Yeah, the common language actually is something that that is becoming more and more challenging because there's a sort of cultish quality to this, the illiberal paradigm, the critical theoretical paradigms, the post-colonialism, the critical race theory, the critical fat studies, critical gender studies, all of these theories rely on, as you said, an inability to disagree or an unwillingness to accept disagreement. But they also require a sort of new linguistics, a set of words that mean, they may be words that we use in the vernacular, but they don't mean the same things in these theories, like whiteness. And then when you try to have a conversation with somebody, you're not talking about the same thing. How does that, I recall there was something about this in history recently, some professor having some issue. Now I can't remember what the...
So, look, you're absolutely right, and it's interesting because we talk about, shared language. So what they've created is an insider's language, right? And once they start talking, it, right? So the most popular phrases that have reached, the broader intellectual community go from wokeness to intersectionality to white privilege, right? Each one of them, there's a kernel of a good idea, but they've been distorted and turned into an orthodoxy, and they've also been turned into a weapon. And that's when they become toxic. But it's more than that. So they have this way of speaking about themselves. They also add that psychobabble language of, and I'm getting this sometimes. I write an article in the Jewish press, and somebody says, "I'm wounded by what you said." Like, Idan Amedi, the great Israeli singer, who could have spent the war just singing, which is holy enough, but he went and fought, and he absorbed an explosion, and he had pieces of shrapnel in his neck. He had pieces of shrapnel in his body that they pick out. That's wounded, right? To use this language to show that you're spiritual and to show that you're part of this cult is, especially during wartime, and especially, I'm sorry to say, within the Jewish community, quite offensive and so self-involved and so self-absorbed that it's almost a form of insanity. And I think when we hear DEI to DEI person talking, when we hear that internal language, when you go to academic conferences, you go, what language are they speaking? But they're speaking their language. Mm-hmm. And it's so important that, first of all, we, to use one of their phrases, call them out and say, this language is a distortion. It's language that obscures. And it goes back to one of the things we kind of sidebarred, which is that when you don't specify that the gendered violence on October 7th was by Hamas against Jews, when all these university presidents on October 8th, 9th, 10th said, we understand there's distress in the Middle East, as if it was a weather system, and literally the president of Cornell University compared it to hurricanes, then what you've done is, and this is writing 101, you've obscured the actor. Historians also teach, never obscure the actor, right? Because, and I'm sure in psychological work also, you don't obscure the actor because then you're just stuck in the soup, right? You have to say who's done what. So we have to call out that language, but more important to me is we have to rebuild our language. We have to rebuild the language of genuine liberalism, of genuine conservatism, a language of respect, a language of patriotism, a language that is rooted in the founding fathers and mothers, that's rooted in Martin Luther King, that's rooted in John F. Kennedy, that's rooted in Betty Friedan, that's rooted in all these amazing people who helped us get to where we are. And we also see, okay, there was more work to do. But I'm not creative enough. I just can't think of a better treasure chest of ideals and values than what we inherited in America. And to watch at the elementary school level, at the high school level, at the college level, in media, in book publishing, that treasure chest be purposely dismantled, purposely demeaned, purposely devalued is terrifying. Because, and this is actually what one of the 7th graders said to me, he said, 50 years from now, do you think America will be as strong as it was? We were talking about, for the Model UN, foreign policy. And I said, I'm just not sure. And it's the first time in my life where I'm just not sure. Because I see leaders allowing this kind of, basically, liberal suicide to take place. Now, I'm enough an optimist because I'm a historian that I also know in the 1970s people lost faith in America, and we go through our ups and downs. But this kind of assault on core values by the most influential people in society, using social media and mainstream media and the universities, is quite unnerving. And in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan pushed back against some of the nihilism of the 1960s and 1970s politically, but it didn't succeed culturally. And the late Todd Gitlin wrote a book, and he was lamenting. He said, the left lost the White House, but took over the English department. And he was saying that was a failure of the left. And I once quoted it, showing that actually it worked. And he sent me a letter before his death saying, wait a minute, you're misquoting me. I said, no, I'm not misquoting you. But you actually got to something, which is they understood that in a culture war, the White House comes and goes. But if you take over the English department, and then they become the elementary school teachers, they become the high school teachers, they become the gatekeepers in publishing, they become the gatekeepers on television, they become the media stars, you actually have much more influence.
Yeah, and also that quote was, I think he didn't share the understanding of culture preceding politics.
Right. Because he was a politico, right? Yeah. So he was a political activist. So he was lamenting their political loss, but not seeing the power of their cultural gain.
Yeah, and that goes back to what you were saying, too, about the anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and fundamentally anti-Semitic material that gets pumped into schools. Somebody asked me maybe a week ago if once the kids get to college, is it too late? And I think you and I have had the same experience with students that it's not too late. They actually really do want to disagree. They really want to hear different positions, different arguments for things. They want to know, they want to use their brains, they want to do critical thinking. But a lot of higher education has now been set up to prevent thought instead of to encourage thinking. It used to be that we would say, college should be for teaching how to think, not what to think, or education, whatever. But it's actually teaching not to think. What is how do we best impact on each of these levels? You were talking about, the K-12 and then higher education and then post.
I'm hoping, not predicting, but hoping that this might be a bit of a moment. We've seen the donors revolt, but I'm a little bit wary of the donors revolt on campuses. First of all, as an academic, I instinctivly don't want outsiders coming and bullying us, especially based on their money. Secondly, I watch and I hear the conversation going on in, let's go, Fox News world, right, on the right. I hear the conversation going on in the Jewish world. I don't hear your typical mainstream blue American middle to upper middle class mom and dad who are going to be sending their kids to these schools complaining. And I think partially because of the toxic dynamics around Trump, that because Trump and DeSantis are anti-woke, and that means that I have to be pro, somehow the conversation continues to get distorted. We even saw, Claudine Gay gave an embarrassing performance on October 8th when she also issued a statement that was just not moral. Even the New York Times called it tepid. And then she gave another embarrassing performance. Then she gave another embarrassing performance at the hearing, at the congressional hearing. And then there were accusations of plagiarism. So there was a whole, Bill Ackman's line that she caused more reputational damage to Harvard in her 4 months than any other president in the 380 or 400 year history of Harvard. It was devastating. And yet we still heard that the right won, that it was a right-wing coup, or that it was against her as an African American woman, when it was just she failed in her task. So that suggests that the problem runs much deeper. That's what scares me, and that's why I focus on the learned societies, the American Sociological Association, the American Historical Association. I see how deep the rot has gone. But as educators, we never give up. So you hope one by one, you hope class by class, that there'll be enough to change. On the university level, I think the first thing that has to happen, I would tell the gazillionaires, is build centers. If in each university there was a center of critical thought, And the focus is exactly what you said. The focus was on how to think, not what to think. How to learn, not what to learn. And it was well funded. And then you started having caucuses and conferences by these various professors at the center at Harvard and the center at Rutgers and the center at Yale and the center at UNLV. And they all came together. So first of all, they had their own society which promoted them, hired them, gave them prizes, because you really have to create an alternate universe. I think it's going to be decades, because we're seeing that the young people, the 20 and 30 and 40-year-olds coming into and this is mostly, it's worse in humanities and social sciences, they're in it, right? They've already been propagandized. So they're going to be social justice warriors for decades. So within the university, though, you can create a center, and then you have an opportunity for students as consumers to say, hey, wait a minute. I'm being pushed to think. I'm being pushed to write. I'm being pushed to sharpen my analytic skills in this class. How come it's not happening there? And then perhaps those centers will grow. And if the centers fail, then they fail. But that's the way I would do it on the university level. I think on the elementary school and high school level, this is really an issue of politics, right? And I think this is starting to happen. I think people are starting to understand that there has to be more scrutiny. And again, as an educator, I want as much autonomy as possible. But if I see that educators are miseducated, if educators are hijacking the classroom, if educators are turning what should have been the neutral political, the neutral professorial podium into a political platform, and then doing it also at the high school and elementary school level, then I need my state legislatures. I need my city councilors to stand up and say no. And we have to start having political battles over these curricula, which are raising our kids to be anti-American. I mean, that's 101, right? You at least have to start with a basic love of country, and or dismantle the public school system. If you want to go to a private school, which is the I Hate America private school, go ahead, free speech, I'm with you.
Right.
But also, it's also a consumer rights thing. I think one of the things that also helped was that during COVID, parents were at home, and they're listening in to the nonsense that some of their kids are absorbing. And again, if we write this history 20 years from now, we'll look back and say, oh my goodness, there was a bit of an awareness then. And then George Floyd pushed things back, because in the very proper reaction of abhorrence to the murder, there also became this overreaction where this anti-racist ideology became the only way to think about things. And so that kind of shut down the thoughtful, critical conversation that was starting among parents. And perhaps October 7th will be a moment where people, not just Jews, because again, I keep on emphasizing, this is not just a Jewish issue. This is a liberal issue. This is an American issue. We'll say, wait a minute, there's something going on here. There's something broken. When something's broken, then you can try to fix it.
Speaking of broken, it seems like the understanding of the history of the founding of the United States is fairly broken, and the history of Israel. And they're sort of broken in the same ways. It doesn't seem to be a coincidence.
No, I agree with you. I think it's systematic. It's purposeful. It's an assault on the core stories, the core narratives that we tell ourselves, we tell about ourselves. And so the 1619 of America, right? America was founded in 1776, but the New York Times ran this very, I thought, very biased thing from which sort of violated its core mission as journalists. This thing in 2019 saying that we have to mark the 400th anniversary of the first slave ship that brought slaves to America as a terrible moment in American history. I'm with them. We have to see how racism has been a far too central part of the American story. I'm with them. But 1619 wasn't the founding of the country. 1776 was. And the ideals of 1776 were very, very different than the ideals of lack of ideals and the abhorrent behavior of the slave traders of 1619. And to then create not just a New York Times Magazine issue about this, but they literally created a curriculum. And so they pushed a notion of it's very funny because it goes deep into Christian theology, of original sin. That this wonderful country, this amazing experiment in liberalism, democracy, and equality, and everybody who comes being able to get ahead, has this original sin of slavery. It is systemic, and you can never get out of it. And lo and behold, when those same people tell the narrative of Israel, they talk about the original sin being Israel against the Palestinians. As I said earlier, making the Palestinians completely blameless, robbing them of any agency, missing the decisions that they and their leaders made at critical moments. And instead, we have these two countries, which I think are two of the most wonderful countries on the face of this earth, two countries which have very positive, life-affirming, empowering ideologies. Those ideologies are being attacked in their core, in their very core, because the stories they tell about themselves are being told, oh no, they're lies, and you all have original sin, and it's systemic. So Israel will never get over its sins against the Palestinians, and America will never get over its sins against blacks, when in fact, we've seen that Israel isn't deeply hostile to Arabs, because we've had the Abraham Accords, we've had peace with Egypt, we've had peace with, I call this peace more, not peace now. We've seen changes over the years, because history happens, if you let it. And similarly, as I keep on saying, America has evolved away from much of its evil, much of its ugliness, and into a far better place. And we know that, revolutions come not when people are totally down and out, but when there's rising expectations. But this is ridiculous. The inability to be grateful. And I say this as the grandson of immigrants. The ability to be grateful of the amazing opportunities we all have from America. The constant addiction to grievance curdles your own soul. Yeah. Don't think about anybody else for a second. Think about what it's done to you. If I can't go in and walk into a university and say, wow, I'm so lucky to be here. Not because somebody else more belongs, but because I have gratitude for this amazing opportunity. If you're constantly feeling hurt, if I'm constantly competing with you in the victimology Olympics, not only does it distort the society, but it distorts my soul. And I always say I wouldn't trade souls with the anti-American, anti-Palestinian protesters, with the anti-Semites, with the people who hijacked the civil rights movement and don't understand the secrets to success of the civil rights movement. And I wouldn't hijack my soul with these grievance junkies. They might occasionally get occasional victories, but in the long run, I just wouldn't want to be them.
Making me think of two things. One is a letter from a Birmingham jail, where the part that you're making me think of is where Martin Luther King said, I don't know the line by heart, but it was that something like racism distorts the soul.
Yeah.
But he went on to then say that something about, but taking on this this sense of being a constant victim also does that. And so that's the first thing that you make me think of. And then on a broader sense, you're making me realize how much both the problem with the 1619 view of the founding of the United States and the settler colonialist view of the founding of Israel, both of which are false narratives about foundings, but I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'd say that the settler colonialist narrative is even more incorrect,
even more false,
about
right.
Israel. But when you start with those grievances, you end up in a place where you don't care really about individuals. Right? You have to end up by hurting the people whose cause you are supposedly supporting.
We define everybody by group, we define everybody by group grievance, and as a result, we cement them in where they were. As opposed to the American ideal, and the Israeli ideal was always to free. So you're absolutely right. What's happening in 1619 is you're taking the ugliest fact of American history, and you're using it to define every fact in American history, and overshadowing it. I mean, in the original 1619 New York Times Magazine article, they said there's traffic in Atlanta, heavy traffic in Atlanta because of segregation patterns. Now, I could point out that the segregation patterns that there were in Atlanta might have an impact on the way the city grew. But there's traffic in every city. So, what are you doing? So there they take one fact. What happens with Israel is that how could it be that this one small country, which is a quite unique story, where East meets West, where a people who have deep roots to their land, they're the original Aboriginal people, all of a sudden are guilty of settler colonialism, imperialism, racism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing when that was trendy in the 1990s, and now white supremacy and Jewish supremacy. Really?
Genocide.
And now genocide, right? How could it be? I mean, we're so busy, right, doing so many crimes That is classic anti-Semitism. And that's just creating false narratives.
One of the most, I think, influential scholars who sort of created this settler colonialist narrative was, after Said,
right,
is Rashid Khalidi. I think that it's the title of his book,
yeah.
The War Against Palestine, I think, and then the subtitle is something about settler colonialism. What is settler colonialism, and how is Israel not a settler colonialist?
So, settler colonialism, again, interesting idea that there are certain societies which came out of an extractive approach to their neighbors or to elsewhere, right? So the classic settler colonialism narrative would be the British, from far away, came to the United States of America and created this settler colonial society where they imported all kinds of people and killed the Native Americans. There's some truth to that. It's a useful way of understanding some of the things that happened between the people who came and the people who had been here before. But when it becomes an orthodoxy and you only tell the story through that, you miss all the subtlety, you miss the size of America, you miss the emptiness of America, you miss, again, the ideology of America. So similarly with Israel, when you say settler colonialist, you're actually robbing Jews of their story. You're robbing Jews of their roots in this land. You're robbing Jews of any complexity. And so you want to say, I disagree with the settlements in the West Bank. Fine. But you have to at least acknowledge that Jews have a deep, deep tie to that place. That we're still reading from the same Bible, speaking the same language, connected to the same culture. And so that's the distortion. So it is really the big lie.
You're also making me think about the British colonial presence here in Israel and the expulsion of Jews from Gaza in 1929.
Yep.
I was thinking about this the other day as I was, thinking a lot about Gaza and about the 2005 disengagement. And I wondered, there's so much misunderstanding about the history of this region, about not just Israel, but about the parts that were taken in the war of 1967, and then the parts that were given back unilaterally. What's important? What's the most important thing to know about the history of Israel for people who just hear the settler colonial narrative?
When we talk about Gaza, we have to be willing to deal with the facts and be politically incorrect. Let's talk about 3 specific data points. One, in the 1920s, 2 very important things happen. The British come in after the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, collapses, and they have a mandate. It's a mandate that comes from the League of Nations. It's a mandate that's in the wake of World War I. And the mandate includes allowing Jews to settle in the area, what's that expression? Between the river and the sea. That's literally, under San Remo and the League of Nations mandate, the Jews have the right to create communities between that area. And indeed, one of the areas where they settled, a small group, was in Gaza in 1929. There was a much larger community that had been living in Hebron for millennia before that, because while many Jews were in exile, and part of the Zionist story is a story of people spread out all over the world returning, there always were 4 holy cities, Hebron, Jerusalem, Tzfat, Safed, and Tiberias, that were holy cities and always had a Jewish presence. So fundamentally, that means that the Jews have a right to settle anywhere in that area, legally, legitimately. That's number one. And then indeed, when the Arabs rioted in 1929 and the Hebron community was destroyed, and that was an older historic community, the British, to save the Jews, had them leave by railroad from Gaza at Tel Aviv, and they were evacuated. In 1948, the Arab world...
Let me just clarify, sure. Because Hebron is not in Gaza.
No, it's not in Gaza. I'm just giving 2 examples of 2 cities that were affected by the Arab riots.
And so there were Arab riots in 1929 in Gaza and in Hebron.
In Hebron and also in Tel Aviv and in various spots, but two of the communities that ended up really being destroyed, and that was the idea. The idea was, we've got too many Jews coming in, let's get rid of them. And the two places where it worked most effectively was in Hebron, which is in today's the West Bank in Judea, however you want to call it. And that community was destroyed. Rapes and pillaging and a very, very intense, disgusting sexual violence, which we also saw on October 7th. And in Gaza, the very small Jewish community, which had just been growing, was removed by the British because the British were trying to keep order because they were in charge.
My recollection is that there were more people killed in Gaza than there were in Hebron.
In different parts, but there also was many of them were saved, and in Hebron, I think the percentages were higher. Although some people also escaped from Hebron. The point is that the Jews had legitimate rights by the international community to settle there, and violence changed things. In 1948, the Arab world, having rejected the 1947 UN partition, the UN compromise, which would have given we call it now a Palestinian state, but they just called it an Arab state and a Jewish state, and that Arab state would have incorporated Gaza. Nevertheless, in 1948, when Israel declared itself a state, they attacked 7 Arab armies, depending on how you count, but including what we would now call Palestinian irregulars. In the process of that fight, Jordan took over what it started calling the West Bank, what Jews traditionally called Judea and Samaria, carving it out with no international legitimacy. San Remo is still relevant. The Jews have the rights to live there, but now Jordan is controlling it as a result of the 48-49 war. Similarly, not by the river, but by the sea, by the Mediterranean Sea, Egypt carves out an area, this Gaza Strip, and all of a sudden, Egypt, with no international legitimacy, without relinquishing San Remo, takes over the Gaza Strip. And so from 1948, or 9, depending on how you want to count, but pretty much from 48 until 1967, Egypt controls the Gaza Strip with no international legitimacy. In 1967, Israel, being threatened with destruction by Egypt, being threatened with destruction by Jordan, being threatened with destruction by Syria, attacks in a preemptive strike and wins territory from Syria, from Jordan, and from Egypt, including Gaza. So, in both cases, Israel's returning to land, which it legitimately had from the San Remo Declaration and from the League of Nations mandate, and the world had never changed the ownership. So, it's doubly legitimate. So, if Israel decided, and I'm not advocating it, but it's just important that we accept the theoretical position that if Israel decided tomorrow that it was going to settle in Gaza to punish the Palestinians, we could debate the rights and wrongs of it tactically and strategically, but legally, legitimately, they have the right to do it. And that doesn't necessarily mean I'm taking a position one way or the other, but we have to at least learn the history.
So you're saying that the only acknowledged legitimate title holder, essentially, for that land was Israel? I
would say the most acknowledged, because the Arabs can make a case that in 1947, the UN partition gave them rights to that area. But they were the ones who rejected it, right? So you can see that historically they have a certain connection there. But all I'm saying is that the Jewish connection has never been negated and is from the 20th century, not from the biblical times.
And before the 20th century, my understanding is that Jews were in the Gaza region from about the 2nd century BC?
Yes, and if we go all the way back to the Bible, the famous story of Samson and Delilah takes place in Gaza, right?
I didn't know that.
So there is a long historic connection, because one of the things we Americans forget is just how small this little area that everybody talks about is. It's a really small area. So Jews are moving back and forth, Philistines are moving back and forth. There's a lot of action, but it is mentioned in the Bible, and it's mentioned at various other points throughout Jewish history. So those little annoying facts just reframe the conversation. And then you take, to me, the most relevant fact, which is that in 2005, and I'm skipping over lots of history, but in 2005, as an attempt to not be called an occupier, as an attempt to give the Palestinians autonomy. And was there also a hope, perhaps, of separating the Gazans from the West Bankers? Probably in Ariel Sharon's mind, that was part of it. Ariel Sharon disengages from Gaza. And there's a big fight. Should we stay at least in the Philadelphia corridor, which is the southern corridor, which is now very, very controversial, between Gaza and Egypt? And his generals say, we can't withdraw from it because you know what's going to happen. They're going to smuggle all these weapons. They're already building tunnels. In 2005, there are already tunnels. They're just going to build more tunnels. They're going to smuggle war weapons. And Ariel Sharon says, I don't want to be called an occupier. We've got enough trouble. It's complicated enough in the West Bank, which is much smaller. Let's have purity in Gaza. And he says, militarily, it'll be easy. We won't have 21 settlements, which are 21 circles surrounded by hostiles in the Gaza Strip, but we'll pull back and dislodge 8,000 or 8,500 Jews from that area, many of whom employed and worked with Palestinians, and we'll have clarity. I don't think most people in the world realize how deeply betrayed Israelis feel by the fact that almost immediately the accusations were flying that we were occupying even though we withdrew. The accusations were flying that we were blockading even though we saw all the armaments that they've been able to bring in. The accusations were accompanied by rockets flying, whenever they wanted to, turn it on, turn it off. And that it culminated 18 years later in the most horrific of massacres. So when the world then says, oh, two-state solution, or withdraw from more territory, Israel's going, have you not learned anything? If one person calling for a two-state solution accompanied it with a historical analysis and said, look, I get why the Gaza disengagement didn't work, but this is why it's going to be different. And then goes back actually and says also, because the Oslo peace process, which I even skipped over, also Israelis feel like we withdrew. We had a shot at a possibility of a Palestinian state of two-state solution, and the result was 1,000 people killed in the most personal kind of terrorism
in the second
intifada of bombing cafes and buses.
Just go back to the Oslo Accords for a moment. Where did Israel withdraw from?
So the Oslo Accords are more complicated. So let me just finish the point and get to it. So Israelis are saying twice we withdrew for peace. The cleanest, simplest, most dramatic withdrawal was in Gaza, and we've lost over 2,200 people on the altar of your peace plan. What do you want from us? Give me something different. And that's where there's a huge gap even between the conversation that's going on in American Jewish circles and in Israel. Now, the Oslo situation is more complicated because if we go back to the territories, Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, a similar story needs to be told, as I said, which is that Jews have legitimate rights to settle there under San Remo. They have a much deeper tie to Judea and Samaria because of a lot of stuff that happened, historically in the Bible. But we'll put that aside. Let's just talk about the 20th century. Jews have a legitimate right. The Jordanians step in and again just seize it. It's not recognized by the United Nations, and in 1967, Israel takes over. Nevertheless, when I was challenged by historian friends, I said, just give me one example in history where a nation with a border dispute and hostile neighbors was attacked, defended itself, seized territory to which it had a right, which was in dispute, and then gave it back willingly. The only times I know in history, and no one's corrected me yet, the only times I know are when Israel went into the Sinai in 67 and gave it back in 78, 79 to Egypt. And the second time was with the Oslo Accords. So what happened with the Oslo Accords? It's more complicated because it's a much smaller area, because Israelis and Palestinians live cheek by jowl, city by city, town by town. The genius of Oslo was, you know what? Let's just lessen the Israeli military footprint on the most number of Palestinians possible. So the biggest cities in the Palestinian area, Jenin, Hebron, Ramallah, became autonomous and were controlled by this thing that was created called the Palestinian Authority. And so the idea was, first start there, and they divided the West Bank into areas A, B, and C. And areas A said, and the notion was you'd have different levels of Israeli security, but the idea was to give the Palestinians as many Palestinians as possible, as much autonomy as possible. And without going into the sad history, the fundamental result was that in the summer of 2000, in July 2000, when there was an attempt to make a big final deal with Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat under Bill Clinton's auspices, Arafat didn't even give a counteroffer to a very sweeping, quite generous offer, and turned back toward terrorism, which had been growing anyway. Bill Clinton himself said to Arafat, "I failed because of you." And he blamed Arafat. But of course we forget all that because it's more fun to blame Israelis. So Israelis are sitting there going, so we had this whole process. Did we make mistakes? Of course, but we had this whole peace process, and they called it the peace process, the Oslo peace process, throughout the 1990s. There was an attempt. There was a critical mass of Israelis who were ready to make all kinds of compromises. And the result, 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, was Seder's being attacked, synagogues being attacked, cafes being attacked, buses being blown up. What are we, idiots? At what point do you learn from history? And at what point do you say, oh no, history doesn't matter, let's try it all over again? Right? You know, the classic Einstein line about insanity being, just making the same mistake again and again. So until the international community is willing to explain to Israelis why this is different, why the two-state solution this time has a shot at working, I think few Israelis are willing to take another risk. I won't risk my kids. I don't want my neighbors risking their kids. And I don't want to be thrown under the bus by anybody who will feel better sipping coffee in Washington, the Upper West Side, because we've let them worship at this delusional shrine called the two-state solution. If it's a real offer, make it a real offer, but it has to be based on A, Arab willingness to accept us, when 89% of Arabs in a recent poll said they don't accept Israel to exist, and B, the right of the intelligent learning from history of what's changed.
One of the things I think people don't grasp in that conversation is what is the what allows Israel to prevent Palestinians from having a state, right? And I think what you're pointing to is both in Gaza and in the West Bank, Palestinians had statelets, right? They had autonomous control in Gaza much more even than in the West Bank. And had they not used that to launch terrorist attacks, there would have been a state. Is that about right?
Right. The easiest, cleanest situation was Gaza because they had a contiguous piece of land that they controlled, right? And even the New York Times, in a recent article talking about the tunnels, the tunnels were built in areas under which they controlled. They literally used that phrase. And I said, who's the they? The they I read is Hamas. So if Hamas controlled that area under which they built the tunnels, then that means they weren't occupied. Like, words count. and so and by the way, the other thing is, all these lies about people sit in Manhattan. You're a little familiar with Manhattan. People sit in Manhattan and call Gaza the densest place in the world. They're sitting on the 50th floor, right, of one of the densest places in the world, and talking about Gaza, which I think its tallest building is 12 stories, and there are vast areas of Gaza which are just empty, and they're calling it the densest place in the world. It just isn't.
They also call it a concentration.
They also call it the world's largest open-air
prison.
Concentration camp or prison, when there's a beautiful sea coast, and Israel controls 2/3 of the border, but the other part of the border is controlled by Egypt. So these phrases that you read in the New York Times, you read in the Washington Post, you hear coming out of policymakers are divorced from reality and are delegitimizing and demonizing of Israel, and feed the Palestinian delusion that the world is with them. But we know at the end of the day, the world's going to turn its attention to somewhere else. We know at the end of the day, Hamas is much more interested in its apocalyptic dreams than in improving Palestinian lives. And we know at the end of the day that it's the Palestinians who are going to suffer. And so I always say, who's more Islamophobic? Somebody who reads the Hamas charter and says, they don't really mean it. They're just being Arabs. Or someone like me, who reads it and says, oh my goodness, they want to destroy us. Similarly, who's more Islamophobic and who's more disrespectful of Palestinians? Somebody says, oh, well, look, just ignore their behavior over the last 75 years. They'll take whatever, they'll take whatever compromise. Or me who says, wait a minute, these people have agency, have determination. It actually comes out of respect for who they are, the story they tell themselves, the aspirations they articulate, the things that make them celebrate and give out candy and forward things happily on October 7th. Out of respect for them, I have to take them seriously. But also out of respect for them, I have to hold them responsible. And that's the great failure going on right now. No one's holding them responsible. They're always innocent. People throw out the number that there are 27,000 dead, 27,000 innocent Palestinians. Well, that means that either you've absolved every one of the Hamas murderers and rapists and marauders of guilt, or that the IDF is not the most moral army in the world, it's actually the most immoral and most incompetent army in the world, because in 20 days of fighting, they haven't killed one terrorist. So pick your delusion.
I know I'd said that was the last question.
Okay.
It comes back to what you were saying earlier about the difference between Islam and Islamism.
Right.
And I wanted you to just finish by unpacking that a little more, because I don't think that people really understand that there is a difference, and they don't understand what Islamism is. Can you just say, we know Islam is a religion. Islamism is not devotion to the religion. What is Islamism?
Let's take one step back. One of the problems with the Western mind is we're transactional. At the end of the day, we're all playing let's make a deal. And we want to find some deal that works. There are other minds that are apocalyptic, that look at things in messianic terms, that look at things in religious terms, that look at things in very different ways. The Islamist movement is an apocalyptic movement within Islam that takes the idea of jihad and uses it to say that we are the only legitimate religion, that the world is divided into those who submit to us and submit to our God Allah, and those who don't. Those who don't submit need to be killed. And we saw this with ISIS. We saw this with Al-Qaeda. We saw this most recently with Hamas. And one of the things that scared many people around the world was they understood that this wasn't just an attack on Jews, as deeply anti-Semitic as it was, and as focused on Israel as it was, but it was an expression of this apocalyptic Islamist worldview that looks at jihad not as an opportunity to do good, not as an opportunity to improve yourself, as certain other branches of Islam would suggest, but they take the words of Islam, they distort them, and they turn it into a form of extremist fundamentalism, which is very all or nothing, and is very apocalyptic, and doesn't just target the Jews. It targets Christians. It targets those who believe different forms of Islam, and to not acknowledge that, to simply throw out cliches about Islam being a religion of peace, is intellectually reprehensible. It's as reprehensible as ignoring the history. You want to come to various conclusions, fine, do it, but at least sit with the facts, sit with the complexity, and in this case, you also have to sit with the hatred. You have to sit with the hatred of the other that, not just on October 7th, but we saw with ISIS, leads to reducing women to sex slaves simply because they disagree with you theologically, that maims and amputates people and tortures people in the ugliest of ways, let alone, of course, killing and kidnapping for sport. And you got to really sit with that evil. And if you don't, A, you're being purposely naive, and B, as I keep on saying, you're not even respecting who they are and the message they've been sending out for 20, 30 years at least. You can go deeper, but certainly in the last 30 years has been this very rabid form and very dangerous form of Islamism.
And that Islamism is, its goal is global
domination. Again, don't trust me. Read the books. Read what they say. Read their internal conversation about themselves. Read a fascinating book by Paul Berman shortly after 9/11, where he was a good American liberal living in Brooklyn, stunned by the attack on the Twin Towers. So he simply started going to the bookstores in his neighborhood that sold jihadi tracts, and got some friends to help with translation, read them, those that were in English, and he unpacked the entire ideology. And it's one of many studies, right? You can simply go online these days, read what they say to one another, read what they preach, read what goes on in far too many mosques, and then say, okay, I'm either going to ignore those facts because I want to live in a world where those facts are inconvenient to me, or I'm going to deal with those facts. And that's, I think, October 7th should have been, like 9/11 should have been, a wake-up call to the world. Not to hate, but to be wary of people who themselves call themselves your enemy. If you can't acknowledge that somebody's threatening to kill you, then what kind of self-worth do you have? And this to me is really a core attack on the West. And there's a self-destructive, suicidal strain in the West that both is filled with self-loathing and self-hatred, and we're seeing that in the elementary schools and high schools, in the universities, and also ignores central threats. What do you think they're going to do to women? What do you think they're going to do to gays? What do you think they're going to do to liberals? What do you think they're going to do to intellectuals when they take over? They've shown it, right? On October 7th, they took particular glee in killing some of these peaceniks who lived on the border, who drove them back and forth to hospitals. They took particular glee in shooting Muslims who quoted Quran to them and said, I'm a Muslim. And nevertheless, some of them were maimed, some of them were shot, some of them were left for dead, some of them were killed. Like, really? So you showed your behavior, you showed your values, and now we're going to ignore it or excuse it? I'm not ready to ignore it, I'm not ready to excuse, and I'm certainly not ready to forgive or apologize.
Thank you.
That was fun.